Exhibition, we had a call of submission for artwork related to archive, and it's not only related to new media art, but we accept artwork for related to archives as a topic. And so we formed an international jury for the work and shortlisted the selected artworks for this exhibition. And it is an online exhibition, so you guys could go into the webpage and have a browse the exhibition. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much as well. So first speaker will be Lawrence Bird from University of Barcelona.
Thanks very much, Oliver. Thank you, Terry. Thank you to the organizers of ISEA. So my name is Lawrence Bird. I actually work most of the time as an architect for a firm in Canada called Sputnik Architecture. I teach occasionally at the University of Manitoba. I'll tell you a bit about myself and how the work came to be. There's more information on the website, but I'll give you some information that's not on the website. So I first worked in archiving as a research assistant at the Canadian Centre for Architecture around 2007, while I was doing a PhD in History and Theory of Architecture at McGill University. So I worked for a project called DOCAM, which was a Canadian initiative on the preservation of media art. Early on in this conversation, everyone is still having. Our part of this at the CCA was the preservation of work of digital architecture, The Embryological House, which is by Greg Lynn, who was cutting edge in digital architecture in the late 1990s. Working in preservation, though, I became interested in how implicit in the problem of remembering always seemed to be the necessity of forgetting something, and how technology is kind of tied up in that. I'm especially interested in Bernard Stiegler's writing on this in the Techniques and Time books. I'm now a practicing architect, but this is also something people who make buildings have to think about, because we have our own archives, and we also build archives, and we also build memorials. Something our firm is working on right now, for example, is a memorial First Nations and Métis Indigenous site. I'm also a media artist, and it's as an offshoot of that work that I came to produce this project in mobile, which is the result of an embarrassingly low-tech process, but one that I think does matter for the conversation. So after working in the CCA, I went back to my PhD, which I was looking at images of architecture in the city in Japanese anime. And I looked at an animated version of the film Metropolis, which is based on a manga from the 1940s, and of course also on Fritz Lang's film, from 1927. I became very interested in film of the 20s, especially Lang's, because of the way it represents architecture and bodies. Of course, the problem for that era is how to preserve film without it bursting into flames. And often the way to do this is to duplicate it in other media. I accidentally fell into some version of that while grappling with a broken monitor on an old MacBook Pro and playing back DVDs of those films from the 20s. It was an old computer of mine, and for some reason the monitor had started blurring images. Frames of any moving image were preserved on the screen longer than they ought to be. And in some kind of realization of the persistence of image, the result was a blurring of anything that moved and turning it into a kind of a liquid, which you can kind of see on these are just excerpts from the film in the back. Anything static becomes somehow super solid. Oh, is it okay? The loop seems to have stopped. Is there a way I can get that? Okay, here we go. Yeah. The result was a blurring of anything that moved, rendering it liquid, and anything that was static almost seemed to become super solid. So it was only by accident that my laptop started producing something exquisite, I felt, as a result of the malfunction. So I started obsessively recording these on a cell phone. And I tried out different films to see how they would appear on the broken screen. I naturally gravitated toward Lang's because they so strikingly juxtapose the human body and its architectural frame, especially Lang's M. So this, you probably know, is the story of a hunt for a murderer, a child killer, by not just the police, but also by an alliance of criminal gangs who use their jailbreaking and bank robbing skills to track down the killer and actually put him on trial before their own criminal justice system. So at some level, the story is about a complicity between the law and its violation, authority and criminality. which seen in the context of Germany in the 1930s has specific overtones. This film is from 1931, a thesis from SIGGRAPH from Caligari to Hitler. At another level, though, this is more generally, I think, about how we try to capture, imprison, make still things that, that's perfect, things that elude us, and how that eluding is somehow implicit in or generated out of the act of trying to pin something down. And this resonates with Bernard Stiegler's ideas, which he sort of sums up in the phrase, the straight line generates the bent. Lang's work continually comments on architectural and urban space and its representation. He also frequently presents us with catalogs of archives of objects and people. Filing cabinets, storage rooms, banks, prisons, maps, measuring devices, an index of index fingerprints, streets and taverns which imprison us, and which Walter Benjamin, you'll remember, exhorted us to break down through the dynamite of the 10th of a second. Prisons and archives all fail to save us. Remembering always implies some degree of forgetting. Salvation requires that something be sacrificed. Perhaps, rather than preservation, the most we can hope for is some kind of salvage. Thanks very much.
Next speaker will be Marcella Antican-Volates. I hope I pronounced it correctly.
More or less.
From Bremen University.
Yeah. 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 Hi everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Marcela Antican-Volates. I'm a designer and media artist, and also a master's student at the University of Arts in Bremen, in Germany. Yeah, within this talk, I will show you a project I did some years ago called Visualize Ilkun. Here it is. But I will tell you a little bit of context before. The starting point was Willem Flusser's book, The Shape of Things. Here he elaborates on how tents are nomadic heirs of the first dwellings of human beings had, the caves. The cave wall serves as a support for image fixation through what we know as a cave painting. Then the wall of the tent, by analogy to its predecessor, will also have those characteristics of containing information. And he also elaborates, for example, on how the word screens in Portuguese means tela, which in Spanish is actually cloth or clothing. And so I'm simplifying a lot because I don't have so much time, but he's basically proposing that screens as a broader concept has a memory condition. But what kind of memories? When I thought about memory in Chile, my home country, I linked it to dictatorship years mostly. However, another type of memory exists or coexists, specifically linked to one of its native people, the Mapuche. They firstly resisted the Spanish colonizers and managing to defeat them and remain independent for more than 250 years. However, historically, Chilean state stole lands and committed vast numbers of abuses that leads to a still running conflict. That's why for this kind of experimental installation or project, I felt that it was a memory that seems to me much better. I came across with this book on your right. And which is called The Reason of the Anger. And I took it as a study book. And also I did something like can be called maybe like a media archaeology research on screens. And I also wondered how could I represent human feelings like grief, pain, anguish, describes on how Mapuche people felt when dispossessed from lands. So I consulted Johanna Drucker, and she gave a glimpse on how could I work with subjective data like dispossessed from lands when films, like films, sorry. So my proposal for this project was consistent in installation of 8 acrylics placed vertically one after another that alludes to a fragmented screen of 8 layers. Each of the layers are 8 chapters of the book and represent 8 stages that describe the history of Mapuche conflict from the Spanish arrival to the present day. The installation has the characteristic of being observed from several points of view. And thanks to the transparency capabilities of the acrylics, in order to understand what is happening now in this territory, it is necessary to make a tour around the fact to understand the reason of the anger, or ikon in Mapudungun, from the present to the past and from the past to the present. So my methodology in order to systemize this data or this information was, first of all, read the entire book and define recurring topics relating to feelings of anger, sadness, or rage. And then I assigned color and I highlighted them in a text. I made a great system to transfer the information into a 2D plane, and I assigned a shape to each of the topic I highlighted. 1 minute, okay. Unfortunately, I cannot go further on this, but here you can see a little bit of how I transfer the information, and here how I assign some shapes, and also some experimental shapes of one of the chapter of the book. And here's also a map, but with real data. And so the installation looks like this. And to conclude, or to sum up, the installation connects to the concept of archive in 2 ways. On one hand, there is a disciplinary study within the area of design, media art, that has to what the concept of screen means and how this expanded concept itself harvests the capacity to store present information. On the other hand, the work connects the qualities of device screen with another type of file. In this case, the way to preserve the memory of the territory, specifically the spot memory. Thank you.
Yeah, also looking very much forward for the proceedings. So thanks again. So the next one is Diego Manchante. Is it correct?
Yes, perfect. You can tell me gender hacker if you want. Gender hacker if you want it.
Okay.
This is my nickname.
University of Barcelona.
Thank you. Okay. Okay, thank you to the organizers. It's a pleasure to be here. I would like to introduce you a Queer in the Future, which is part of an artistic series that I have been developing in recent years and is entitled Gender Knot, the series. Gender Knot is an English term that we could translate as navigator of gender or something like that, and that invokes Jason's Argonauts. The term appears for the first time in the documentary Gender Knots, A Journey Through Shifting Identities in 1999, directed by Monica Treu, to refer to those people who travel through shifting gender identities. I take this opportunity to announce that this afternoon at 7:30 at the Filmoteca of Catalonia, they premiere the sequel entitled Generation, directed by the same actor. This artistic research project, can I change? Okay. This artistic research project proposed in a first phase entitled Queer in the Archive, new ways of visualizing narrative based on transfeminist and queer genealogies through transmedia and performative experience that conceive the archive as a living interactive space free of heteropatriarchal codes inhabited by multiple bodies and subjectivities that relate past, present, and future to come. The series articulates an extensive historical research through a diversity of thematic threads that feminist, queer, and trans movement has been weaving during the last 4 decades in our political and artistic context. These genealogies link a whole series of historical, artistic, and collective events, actions, campaigns, exhibitions, interviews, fanzines, performance, etc., forming a complex amalgama of relationships between art, politics, memory, and activism. You have been able to observe 3 different archives in which this methodology has been implemented. Archive, the first one, Archive T, a transfeminist and queer archive. The other one is called Archive FF, about the feminist movement in Catalonia, and Archive ID, an archive of artistic projects around the body, self-representation, and identity construction, developed in the context of the research project Disconnected Bodies to New Processes of Creation and Dissemination of Identity Artistic Practice in Non-Attendance at the University of Barcelona. In a second phase, entitled Queering the Software, the project questions the form of construction of the hegemonic archive through the design of a plugin that allows the collective creation of archives through an online interactive multimedia experience. This plugin has been designed in collaboration with Atelier Estampa using open source code, and it's available in the public repository, the GitHub. Gender Node is a transtemporal and transspatial traveler too, that will invite us to travel through time through a genealogy of key events in the memory of the feminist and LGBTQ movement in your context. During this time, this time capsule, I call it, or time travel, he will show us the archive through a transmedia and performative experience to understand how the representation of the future in history has been imagined from a transfeminist queer perspective. I invite you to watch the video and the performance to understand the research project a little better, okay? And then thank you very much for listening to me. Here is my contact information for anything you need, and enjoy these days in Barcelona. We're in the future.
There you go. The next presentation will be, Andrea, see here, Andrea Plas.
Yes, I'm here.
Oh, okay, remote, okay.
We hear each other, yes?
From Novi Sad.
Yes. So this is Fatberg, a rock-like mass of waste matter living in our sewer system. It is formed by us, by the combination of flushed wet wipes, condoms, cotton buds, napkins, food waste, fat, oil, and grease deposits. So everything we flush down the toilet and wash down from the kitchen sink. But from what it is really made of. We went into search of it. We took a sample from the city sewer company and sent into a lab. We made an electron microscopy to investigate the detailed structure of the tissues, cells, macromolecular complexes, physical and chemical analysis of this waste matter. But we also searched for the sources of our waste in the statistical office of the Republic of Serbia. And what we found out is that we created a clone, our clone, of course, in a different shape and form. We created a new intelligence that is capable of breeding, growing, eating, and eventually, if we don't take care of it, it can destroy our lives. So in order to visualize our Fatberg, we created an online game of chance. By clicking the flush button, the Fatberg is fed by our data. So the data obtained by the laboratory, the wastewater quality data, and the vast number of analytical data taken over from the Statistical Office of Serbia. So this digital data is basically our digital waste. At the Statistical Office of Serbia, there is data on newborns, on drug addicts, on divorces, city traffic, housing, bank accounts, farm animals, and the list just goes on. So the game was built using k-means clustering algorithm. And it had a little chaotic twist because we put many different sources that contextually and numerically didn't have anything in common with each other. So we got this concept of garbage in and garbage out. The algorithm created clusters and estimated, for example, how close the bank accounts are to the number of cattle in South Serbia, or how close is Escherichia coli to the number of drug addicts younger than 20 in Central Serbia. So the algorithm also showed how these clusters are depending on a certain type of bacteria. So biologically, we now know what fatberg is made of. But let's say biopolitically, this experiment opened up a broader understanding of our complex relationship with our waste, and of course its consequences on our ecology. The results of the algorithm are seen each time differently by random generation of data through a 3D diagram illustration. So symbolically, this shows our interconnectedness to every human, non-human, and even non-living entities or structures in this planet. Okay, we took a little sample, a small case study in Serbia, but this can go bigger. Fatberg was first exhibited at the Art and Science exhibition at the Museum of Science and Technology in Belgrade, commissioned by the Center of Promotion of Science in Belgrade. We exhibited also the Fatberg itself. We designed an arcade game for clicking the flash button. And I will take the opportunity also to thank all the other authors of this project for making this happen. Sanja Anđelković, Stefana Janičijević, Jovana Pešić, Luka Lopicić, Vanja Novaković, and also, of course, all the collaborators and the super team of the sewerage system in Novi Sad. Of course, if somebody wants to try its luck, the anatomy of Fatberg is still online by the Serbian version of the title, Anatomia Fatberga.info. Thank you.
Ha, from University of South Carolina. Are you there?
Yeah, I'm here, but I cannot open my video camera. The message said that you cannot start your video because the host has stopped it.
We can see you.
Yep. Hello. I'm very honored to present my project in the second summit on new media art archiving at ISEA 2022. I am Byung-won Ha, an art historian and artist in the field of new media art. The title of my project is Archiving New Media Art Archive. When I teach new media art in class, I often use three major archiving websites in the field of new media art: Arts Electronica Archive, ISEA Symposium Archives, and ACM SIGGRAPH Art Show Archives. I am curious about how other people use them and how far are they away from the homepage. My project Archiving New Media Art Archives documents users' ephemeral searching activities on these websites and shows their activities on archiving websites as a piece of art. When they click 5 times to serve the online archive, the computer automatically turns to the next archive website. Users visit Ars Electronica archive first, then SIGGRAPH Art Show, then ISEA, and again and again. In the end, this project generates a collage image based on the user's search activities on those 3 archiving websites by using Max MSP jitter. In non-linear time, as a spatial collage image, this project documents how users consume these archiving resources and how users can reach different resources in different ways. Originally, after each exhibition day, this project planned to post the final collage image on social media. This is for my video documentation. Thank you for watching.
So the next 2 speakers will be Dario Codigiero from Mitterlab, and I assume you work with our esteemed colleague Krishna, and then Ilian Cassina from Namsor, France. Please.
Hello, can you hear me? I'm just double checking the camera. Yes, it's working. So just switch off the volume and share the screen with you.
Maybe just as a quick intro, so I'm Ilian Cassina. This project.
Okay, here we are. So today we talk about the 3D cartography of COVID-19. It's a collective project with a lot of partners, including Garamantis, Ars Electronica Solutions, Evelyn van der Vogt from the Austrian Academy of Sciences, and Eliane Casernin from Namsor, who is among the public. So when the lockdown started, we started to imagine how we could work together. And as my main skill is data visualization, we created in 2020 this data visualization with all the authors working on COVID, all the scientists. And this is a complex visualization. Basically, it's a network with different vests, but it's interesting because it allowed us to see who are the scientists coping with the pandemic. And here you can see a kind of a word cloud in which the most used keywords are just presented to the viewers. However, doing this on the web browser triggered a lot of problems, especially in computational issues. And we had a solution with the project that started with the cooperation of Ars Electronica. This is a photograph of the Ars Electronica Center. And in such a center, there is a beautiful theater, and this theater is called immersive theater just because you have a double screen, you have a big screen on the wall, you have a big screen on the floor, and basically the speaker can stay on the projection, and even the public can share the same space with the speaker. And you have beautiful technological devices that allow us to increase the complexity of the network visualization. So we created this beautiful network with all the articles published until June 2021 regarding COVID, coronavirus more in general, and we organized this specialization according to the lexical similarity of titles, abstract, and keywords. But what was interesting is that we could create this amazing data visualization, which is a three-dimensional one, in which one single blue point represents publication. So again, 600,000 publication in this visualization. And what is interesting is that the third dimension was dedicated to the time. And here you can clearly see the 2 years in which coronavirus became a pandemic. So one panel, one layer is 2020 and the other one is 2021. And so we created this beautiful visualization. But what was really interesting in this project was the presentation, because we use this theater provided by Ars Electronica Center. And so we were able to present this complex visualization in a theater with this big screen, and everything was moving. But I think the most interesting part was the idea to present the visualization to the public and allow the public to interact with the visualization in a moment of a question and answer. And this is more or less the image that we provided. So my 5 minutes, and here the conclusion about this very short presentation is the idea that we need data literacy. So we need to understand how to read the data, how to understand the data, how to understand the data visualization. And we think that immersive architectures like the one that the Ars Electronica Centers host is a beautiful place to foster this data literacy. Thank you very much for your attention.
Brilliant talk. It's amazing how many countries we have here represented. I wanted Tony and Gwen have an overview on all these countries represented. So the next speaker will be Predrag Sidjani and Luka, I hope you pronounce it right, Tilinger from Creative VR Lab in Serbia.
Joining the conversation he just presented.
So can I invite all the speakers coming up to the front? We have the discussion section now, and also could you please bring back all the Zoom presenters, Anthony? Please, all the artists, please come up to the front. So we will have a quick discussion section. Have a quick discussion. So first of all, any question from the audience about the presentations? Okay. Robert, you have a question?
I have a question to Dario. Are you? Yeah, so fantastic. Okay. So on your visualization of your team on site at Dario, so the COVID-19 and showing this in the deep space. It looked very interesting and beautiful, of course, but how could people interact with this mess of articles? How was that possible?
Sorry, this is an interesting question. Thank you. Just because we moved from a framework that was the one of the browser to another one that is Unity. So Unity is used for video games. And to answer you shortly, the public was invited to play with the joystick in the space. But of course, just one viewer could interact with the visualization with the joystick.
Speakers are also allowed to pose questions to each other, and of course we are ready for your questions in the room. Comments?
So this idea of working with archives as a primary source, what inspired you to do that? Why are you interested in the archive as an artistic medium? Anybody?
Who wants to start? Maybe you go ahead.
As I explained in my introduction, I worked as a PhD student in the archives of the Canadian Centre for Architecture, and I work at the intersection of architecture and media art, and architecture for me is a form of medium. I suppose, but memory is part of the architectural mission of the architect, and I suppose that's the reason for the interest in architecture.
In my case, for my installation, I kind of came across with the notion of memory because the concept of screen has this notion of memory. So then I start to dive deep in what is memory actually, and I search for mnemonic memory and historical memory and human memory and all those kinds of different memories. So, and they're of course connected to the concept of archive anyway. So yeah, I think in my case, at least for this project, it has this connection in terms of memory archiving and media, which is screen.
Can we have some comments from the
Okay, I'm a trans activist, no, from Barcelona since 15 years. And then we started making demonstrations, no, actions in the street. But I realized that the story of our movement, no, we don't have it. It's like we call it the historiographical whole, no. And then I started compromise, no, to begin to archive this story. No? On the other side, my mom is an archivist, sorry, from a city hall archive. And then I think that I made the archive that my mother she never will do it, you know? And then it's like, okay, it's like institutional activists versus activists in archives. No? It's an idea about this.
Then we hand over the microphone to the remote speakers. To Andrea, can you hear me? Would you like to say something?
Yes. Yes. So, for example, I love to work with archives because in that way I explore alternative narratives. They give me some kind of incidental school lessons on history, on geography, everyday life, on the culture. So basically a knowledge repository. But also I think archives are a contradictory and unstable territory between the past, the present, and its possible futures. So it's a very much a contradictory field, which opens up a, how would I say, a discourse on its own paradoxality, because the meaning is always set between what is archived and what is not. So in my projects, I always work with the archived material to show and to focus on the things that didn't went into the archive. If this makes sense.
Petra, would you say something? Or
yes, thank you. First of all, I didn't think about archiving any work in such a way what we already did in virtual reality. Actually, I started to work in VR since 1995. And the project, what we choose for archiving was made in 1998, 4 years later. And this project was really interesting because it's with 3 different authors from 3 different locations. And each of us, we chose one of 3 different philosophers. And according to those philosophers, we wrote a sentence, then a word, then sentence, after that the paragraph, and finally we finish with stories. And all these narratives we send via email to internet to one location, and on this location 2 actors and 1 actor presented this as a speech narrative to auditorium. And this media is really mixed and very different. And because of VR and my deeply involved in virtual reality, especially nowadays when metaverse is growing up, I decided to start to reinterpret this work in virtual reality. And with the virtual reality, we have so many possibilities. What was in this first time of our project of Spiral of Words wasn't possible. And we, in virtual reality, put some features what is related to theater and stage design and stage effects and sound effects. And that's the reason why we made such a complex work. There is fully involved mathematics and physics and so many different things to realize this VR reinterpreted work. And finally, we talk what to do with this and how to make this possible and available to very wide audience. And we decide and choose Oculus Store, and it is a gaming platform, and it's a really worldwide known platform. And we publish this work on this platform. And this work is one of 500 archiving, gaming, and artistic work, because earlier, years ago, 2 years ago actually, we archived another our project called Black Carbon. And this is our second artistic project, what we archived on Oculus Store or Meta Store, how they call it today.
Sorry to interrupt. If I'm correct, we have 2 more minutes. So I would say give another minute for each speaker for young one, if you want to say something, and then another statement by Dario. Thank you, Peter.
Yeah, when I just installed my previous project in a gallery or a museum, I found that sometimes I couldn't properly install my project due to some out-of-date coding and firewall issues. And then I found that it's very important to archive my new media art project to recreate someday with cutting-edge OS or cutting-edge equipment. That's why I am interested in archiving new media art, even though, you know, right, even though we call new media art, but sometimes we couldn't realize it again due to some technical issues. So yeah, that's why I'm here. Thank you.
Yes, so for me, I realized my passion for the archives when I was working in the laboratory of Bruno Latour in Paris at Sciences Po, because many colleagues and friends were working on social networks at this point, scraping data from Twitter, from other platforms online. And then I realized that my passion related to museums, library, and so on was really rooted into this concept of archives and on the fact that we need curatorship to create archives. And so even the ethnographic perspective of this action of creating archives is very interesting. And this is the reason why I like to work with these data sets.
Okay, any other comments? The artists in the room here want to add?
Yeah, I just had one comment.
Okay.
Yes, I just had like to add one comment, which is that this project Dario presented started in a conference a little bit like this one, with a meeting with Evelyn van der Voort, who was also very interested into culture and cultural diversity. And so one of the aspects of this visualization was also to look at this archive also from an angle of cultural diversity through time, which made also for interesting visualizations. And so, because it started in a conference like this, I find it also very interesting to think what will come out of this conference, you know, in terms of meeting new projects around these ideas as well.
Yeah, thank you very much in the name of the organizers, to all the speakers to keep time, and looking forward to see you in 15 minutes, or let's say that in 4:35, yeah, for the next round table.
Thank you, bye.
Everybody trying to shut up phone. Okay, let's go change the name.
A work. So the blockchain itself is a distributed ledger. It's like a database that exists on multiple computers at the same time, and that can be verified through cryptographic signatures so that all of those databases are in sync. This panel is not going to be about the aesthetic value of NFTs. You know, are monkey JPEGs as good as Namjoon Paik? It's also not about the economic impact of NFTs. Does this new crypto economy of Web3 promise a more egalitarian art world, or is it reinforcing the same hierarchies? It's also not going to be about the environmental impact of blockchains, which is a significant topic and one we just don't have time to deal with today. You want to go to the next slide? We're going to start by saying some assumptions. We're going to assume the following are myths. NFT standards typically involve storing art assets on the blockchain. A very common misperception, the blockchain actually only accommodates, most blockchains, a very small amount of data. So instead, what is stored there is a record that then points to indirectly a media asset, such as an image or a sound file or a movie file that's elsewhere on the internet. That's not true of every work, and we will try to focus today on works that have much of their kind of mechanism on chain. But it must be said that starting off, that is not true of most works. Secondly, NFT contracts typically transfer rights to media. No, they don't. So whereas there are exceptions, in most cases, the copyright to the original artwork is not transferred along with the NFT. The NFT is just a token that lets you invest in something that you can sell later or support the artist in other ways. It is not typically transferring the rights to the work itself, or at least the media files. NFTs help establish clear, verifiable provenance. This is also, I think, an illusion that has been promoted by crypto crusaders, where you can see very clearly who sold what over time. That is certainly a promise, but you have to remember that the wallets, the digital sort of currencies that people use to transact in NFTs can be synonymous. So it's not necessarily clear who is buying what from when, and the platforms that NFTs are sold on often obscure this. Finally, adding art to blockchain preserves it for the future. This is a common misunderstanding as well, and one we're going to tackle directly. Some things, however, we do assume are reality. Some creators are registering technically and conceptually rigorous artwork to the blockchain, and those are worth preserving. So that's an assumption we're making based on the works that we've reviewed. Also, there are no official standards for conserving artwork that includes distributed ledgers like blockchains. We're really kind of out on the frontier here trying to figure things out. So we're going to do that in a couple of steps. You want to go to the next slide? First, Regina, an independent conservator who's worked with numerous NFT projects and crypto artists, is going to talk about medium-specific preservation issues, particularly focusing on a couple of case studies that are really people who have been trailblazers in this field. Then John, myself, I'm going to focus on medium-independent preservation issues, how we think a little bit broader about solving the problem of blockchain-based art. Can it be preserved? And finally, John Bell's going to focus in on one of those solutions, namely emulation. Take it away, Regina.
Thanks, John. I often hear that non-fungible tokens are simply receipts and that they have little bearing on the preservation of the often off-chain visual and sonic assets that comprise the artwork. First of all, calling an NFT a receipt for those assets implies that you bought the visual and sonic asset to begin with, which from a legal perspective, I don't even mean the copyright. I mean, just for the artwork, you only have ownership over the on-chain data, but that's another talk. On the topic of this panel, to dismiss all artwork registered to the blockchain or dismiss learning about the underlying infrastructure of various distributed ledger protocols that have arisen since 2009, it ignores the future needs of an important subset of artists that have been utilizing the components and behaviors of blockchain in the literal performative behaviors of their work. Yes, this isn't the majority, but the most rigorous, challenging works that consider media specificity may very well be what is acquired by museums and was ultimately canonized over more populist, fully off-chain works registered to the blockchain. I've picked 4 of many examples to speak about high level, 2 of which we'll dive a little deeper into. In all cases, I will only talk about elements that are relevant to this topic, not the literary influences or art historical interpretations of each work. The first example is going to show that there are artists participating in the more speculative side of the market who are also making works that have on-chain elements. This is Mad Dog Jones' Replicator, for example, in the bottom left corner. Replicator is a work that performs a set of actions over the course of a year. The code base, which is hosted centrally on a server that Mad Dog Jones maintains, creates a set of what we call paper jams or jams. Every time there's a jam in the code, which it's designed to have 6, but it's somewhat unbeknownst to the artist when exactly that jam will happen over the year, the off-chain server needs to communicate with the Ethereum blockchain to mint additional NFTs that move the narrative along in this office motif we see in the bottom, or really the copying machine forward. For John F. Simon Jr. in the second example on the lower right, this is for every icon NFT. Some of you may be familiar with the multiple versions of every icon that have been produced since 1996. The artist was inspired by the promises, false or otherwise, of blockchain technology and created a version that would be fully or mostly encoded on-chain in the smart contract. So there's enough data in the smart contract itself with the help of a team called Divergence, who are based in London, to reconstruct the artwork and the bitmap for a specific image and that the primary collector had a chance to choose off-chain. Its existence on-chain is conceptually relevant to the work. For the 2 examples we'll discuss a little bit further, both the McCoys and Rhea Myers have been contemplating the media specificity of blockchain well before the existence of NFTs, which didn't officially come into existence until 2018, quite literally a protocol written by the creators of CryptoKitties, and in which they specifically, among many things, said that art was a motivation in that original proposal. Rhea was already experimenting with Ethereum protocols in 2014 before it officially launched to the public in 2015. And she was also making works for other chains, including Bitcoin and derivatives at this time. Kevin McCoy often claims to be the first artist to mint a work on the blockchain, particularly the Namecoin derivative in 2014. Although some of us have come to understand that there are artists registering works to the blockchain even earlier than Kevin, with evidence going back to 2013. That said, both artists, Rhea Myers and McCoys, were already approaching these chains as an emerging technology to experiment with, in my eyes, no different than any artist curious about an emerging technology, and not for the speculative or profit motive reasons that many think. So next slide, please. So what exactly is Myers token equals text? Rhea conceived of the token ID on-chain metadata being translatable from a string of numbers into a specific English language text. The unique cryptographic hash generated upon minting the non-fungible token would then determine the color using a translation from the first 3 bytes of that data. To view this without having to manually translate the information yourself, Rhea did create a dApp, or a decentralized application off-chain, that communicates with the Ethereum blockchain via a Web3 JavaScript library, fetching the state and then doing the work of turning it into the image you see here. But you technically do not need the off-chain application. For example, you could reconstruct the English language portion of the text by taking the token ID, translating the decimals into hexadecimals, and then hexadecimal into ASCII, and you would have the same text. But there's also another aspect of the work that makes it uniquely intrinsic to the chain. The concept of the work is in part related to various smart contract protocols. In this case, the more typical non-fungible smart contract protocol that most people use, and a less adopted Ethereum smart contract extension. This extension would allow singular group transactions of multiple typical smart contracts to be bundled together. This is particularly important for understanding the work because each individual token is a fragment of a larger text piece that can only come together if it is in this bundled version of the smart contract extension. Next slide, please. For Kevin and Jennifer McCoy's Quantum Leap from 2021, there are some parallels to the other works mentioned, including Replicator. Visually and sonically, Replicator is not on-chain. It's a series of premeditated videos released after those paper jams occur on-chain. Quantum Leap is a WebGL-based visual and has also been stored as video. It's meant to be primarily interacted with and viewed through a React application that connects to a collector's digital wallet. The work also uses JavaScript in part to communicate with the Ethereum blockchain data, just like Rhea's. And before anyone cringes too much about the WebGL and JavaScript libraries off-chain, not to mention React.js, the McCoys are open to migration on this side. And to me, although not exactly a walk in the park to conserve, we have the mental and tangible toolkit collectively to handle that aspect of it, right? But not really for the blockchain, for I guess anybody in the audience, I'm assuming. The JavaScript library is communicating with the Ethereum smart contract via an Infura node, a reminder that most individuals interacting with blockchains are actually doing it in a not so decentralized way, instead relying on companies that run the nodes for them. Infura is owned by Consensus, the same company that also created the most popular digital wallet that's being used with these blockchains, MetaMask. That said, the on-chain data for the work holds two key parameters that are being fetched: a timestamp and set of integers that determine the current and next phase for the mandala-like primordial star you see here, and that's what they call it. The on-chain data will trigger the off-chain visualizer to do one of three things: to keep the same state, enter a transitional state, which is like a dying star, it starts desaturating in color, and then finally the death of that star is what you see on the right here. When the star dies, collectors have the option to trigger an on-chain rebirth function that shifts the timestamp in the integer and also produces two additional NFTs that don't change in state, but act as bookmarks, as Kevin calls them, to refer back to the dead star visualizer and one other previous state of the star, kind of like, just as a reference point. Not everyone who receives Quantum Leap will reach the death of a star more than once in a 3-year cycle, but there are technically up to 8 possible cycles, and therefore one individual could have up to 64 separate NFTs produced over that 3-year period. Next slide. Now, before we get into the preservation of the works with on-chain code and behaviors, I want to also mention that I've been doing technical artist questionnaires, manuals, advising on primary archival files, web copies, exhibition copies, README text, checksums, etc., and other preventive documentation that are packaged for collectors buying work via these blockchains on or off chain. And a lot of the artists need help with this now, not waiting until an archive or museum down the line shows interest in acquiring it, but when the work is still in production or super fresh in the artist's mind. This is why we need you to also understand these technical things with blockchains. So next slide. Either way, how do we begin considering preservation of an on-chain behavioral element in tandem with off-chain components, or even for works like Every Icon NFT at least, which intended to essentially be fully on-chain? One solution goes back to node operators. Most individual node operators, at least on Ethereum, not to mention the large majority that run the companies like Infura, have strong cryptocurrency profit motives. We know this. But one day, a new shiny object will come in the tech industry, and whatever that may be, those node operators en masse may abandon upholding the ledger, leading to its collapse. Just yesterday, I looked at the global node operators we have on Ethereum, and there's only 2,000 currently. That's really low. That's scary low. I believe at its height, there were at least 12,000. A solution would be for archives and museums to form a consortium of sorts where they each run a full node, including an archival node, not incentivized by cryptocurrency by any means, but to uphold the ledger for the purpose of reactivating these works, following necessary hardware specifications, which I have on the right here, the left here. This is not nearly as energy intensive as mining. I just do want to put that forward. But there may be other solutions beyond upholding the actual live distributed virtual machine, which John Ippolito and John Bell will discuss.
Thanks, Regina. That's really scary. 2,000 Ethereum node operators for this global, supposedly ironclad system. John, if you want to go to the next slide. So people abandoning the network and not sustaining the nodes of a peer-to-peer system like blockchain is a fear. There's a lot of other fears too, and an easy way to get a sense of them is to look at the fine print of the Christie's conditions of sale for a high-profile auction like the Warhol NFTs, the digital NFTs that just occurred last year. And this is literally just a list from their own contract, right? So individuals can forget the special cryptographic keys they need to access their wallet. There are a series of different ways that blockchains can be vulnerable to attacks from bad actors who want to kind of take over the chain and make it do its bidding. Rather than go in detail on all of these, let's just say that what options do we have? Let's suppose that we do want to preserve works that have been created using blockchain. What can we do besides just watch it expire? John, if you want to go to the next slide. Well, fortunately, we have precedents for this, right? In net art, which is going to be a subject of some of the talks tomorrow, artists have created things that are parallel examples to blockchain. So on the left, you have John F. Simon Jr., the same artist that Regina mentioned, created a work for the Guggenheim called Unfolding Object, a box, a virtual box that you could unfold in kind of an infinite number of sort of panels. And every time a new person unfolded one of these works, and again, it's a single website online, but everyone accesses differently, there'd be a new crosshatch, a new kind of mark on that particular panel. And this was a way of sort of recording the actions of viewers and participants in the work in perpetuity, which means if the work ever needed to be recreated, you'd have to ask yourself questions about how to represent the traces of previous viewers. That's comparable to the idea of a blockchain. Each block in the sequence contains references to the blocks before it. That's how it is secured cryptographically. There is a hash, as the technical term, that allows every block to sort of contain seeds of the previous blocks and make sure that they are in fact validated as new blocks are added to the chain. So it's a comparable problem. Like, how would you recreate something that itself depends on past interactions? On the right, you have Keith Obadika's Blackness for Sale, an example of so-called auction art from around the turn of the century. This was another sort of genre of internet art in which people started to challenge the idea of ownership by creating strange versions of things. Like in this case, this artist's own ethnicity or racial identity. People auctioned off their body parts and so forth. And it was a way of sort of changing the terms of what ownership of an artwork meant. So that's another precedent we can look at. John, if you want to go to the next slide. Variable media strategies were created in part to address slippery artworks like this, right? So the variable media paradigm offers 4 possible general directions to move in preserving a work. Storage, keep it the same, make it, fixed to the wall, preserve it in amber. Those are the solutions that have the least change. Migration is the one we're most familiar with from traditional archiving theory, where we take a work that was in, WordStar and move it to WordPerfect, and then move that to Word, and then move that to Google Docs. And every time we lose a little something, but our hope is that when moving to the up-to-date technology, we keep it alive. Emulation is one of the new kid on the block, where a new system makes sort of impersonates an older obsolete technology. It's a very powerful idea. And finally, reinterpretation is really taking the most artistic license with an original work. And I've been really pleased to see this morning a lot of examples of artists reinterpreting archives as a form of keeping those alive. Next. So when we look at how we might apply those strategies to a blockchain that's abandoned or crippled in some way, the obvious example from storage is to let it expire, and that may be appropriate for some works. In the cases of the artists that we talked to in preparation for today's panel, they were like, no, don't let it die. That's definitely not an acceptable option. Freezing it would be to say, well, okay, maybe the blockchain is collapsing, but before it does, we're going to take one snapshot of it and essentially preserve that one block. And so you'll no longer be able to interact with those works, but it will represent a snapshot in time of the blockchain. And none of the artists like freezing it either. The most preferred option of the artists we queried was sustaining it. So in this case, an institution like a museum would have to maintain their own nodes. And Regina alluded to the idea of, maybe you want to join the 2,000 nodes anyway, just to keep the darn thing going. But in this case, you might actually have to take over from this global network and instead support it through an institutional network of, say, Ethereum nodes that you maintain yourself. Next. So sustaining is a nice idea, and it's very popular with the artists, but I'm not sure how there are hidden costs and potential problems with museums doing that. So what other options are there? Well, migration, again, is the most common idea. And one of the artists suggested this might be a possibility. If a blockchain looks like it's on the way out, it's going to die off for technical or political reasons, then what you could do is essentially transfer the artworks to a temporary, what we call a paper wallet, which is essentially a static version where you write down the cryptographic keys required to access that token, and then sort of insert that into another chain, right? So you can imagine this happening in 2 versions of the same sort of cryptocurrency blockchain like Ethereum, or you can imagine it happening, translating from, say, the Ethereum blockchain to a Tezos blockchain that might outlive the former one. So this is a complicated one involving this sort of handoff between 2 chains. I'm not clear myself how much of the original data that's important would make it into the new chain, but it is an option that one of the artists recommended. Next. The third option that I think is actually really interesting, but was not suggested by any of the artists, is emulation. And this, again, is the idea of sort of recreating a version that simulates somehow what the original chain was. So one option would be literally to reset a chain. Well, no one liked that idea, to go back and erase the history of this, what's touted as a permanent historical record. Forking the chain, well, that's a little different because that means that you preserve the history up to the point at which one of the chains, kind of goes bad and the other one continues where it was before. The Ethereum network actually did this in the past. They forked between a bad direction that the Ethereum blockchain was going and a new Ethereum, which is now those kind of standard ones. So there is some precedent there. And finally, continuing would be to sort of like let the first chain die off and then start over once it has gone and kind of move forward from that. To talk about the technical details, John Bell has been thinking about how that might play out in practice.
Thanks, John. So yeah, and one of the things I want to start out with here, talking about the technology, is what exactly it is that the artists themselves are looking at. There is an assumption in many cases that because they're playing with the deep sort of protocols that are part of the blockchain, that there's a lot of information available to them. This is a screenshot from the documentation for Solidity, one of the dev tools that's often used for making this kind of artwork. I thought it was really interesting that they basically say, no, don't worry about it. Because that is the assumption in many programming circles at this point, that there's so much sort of history and libraries and stacks and all of these things that are beyond the scope of the immediate project that just assume that they're going to work. That's great until they don't. So what I would like to introduce here is a walkthrough, essentially taking a case study from the tokens equal text piece that Regina introduced, and say, what would it actually take in order to fully emulate this? Doesn't mean that that's necessarily the best decision in every case, but what would it actually take? So what does this ecosystem look like in order to create an NFT-based artwork, in this case, the tokens equal text? So there's a couple of components to it. There is the blockchain and the Ethereum virtual machine itself, the thing that runs all of the tokens and nodes. There is the custom code that is part of the application, part of the artwork. There are often off-chain dependencies, in this case being stored in IPFS, another decentralized way of storing files online. And then there's the actual user client side of things. This broad overview of the live system is necessary to think about what is it that we're actually going to reconstruct here. So I'm going to break each of those pieces down a little bit further. To begin with, when we talk about the blockchain, what are we actually talking about here? And how could it be recreated without it just being that big cloud thing off in the internet somewhere? The blockchain consists of Ethereum nodes that run Ethereum virtual machines, EVMs. It also consists of the blockchain data itself. In many cases, and there's a number of different technologies you can use to actually build out those individual EVMs and nodes and run them, there are ways to encapsulate the entire server functionality in a container that you can make portable between different pieces of hardware. And this is often how it's distributed. In this case, I'm looking at a particular Ethereum node implementation called Geth. This runs, or it can be distributed at least on a Docker node. Docker nodes you can think of as sort of lightweight virtual machines. So once you have one of these Docker images in place, you can create as many of those as you want and put them together on the same piece of hardware and have them communicate with one another. It should be said that this is not necessarily trivial because there is a pretty decent hardware allowance required to underlie all of this. And each of these nodes needs its own copy of the chain. So it can stack quickly, but it can also stack between institutions, as Regina suggested earlier. So it doesn't necessarily have to all be on a single institution. So that's the chain that is accessing. What about the artwork itself? If you think of the chain data as essentially and this is not always the case, but it's often the case, storing variables that are then read by an external piece of software in order to render or to deliver the piece to a particular viewer. What does that external software look like that's reading the variables out of the blockchain? Well, in this case, it's custom code that is web-based. So there's an Apache server, there's the actual rendering engine itself that is incorporating the Web3 JS library that Regina mentioned. And then there's the underlying software, but there's also a number of external dependencies that are part of this too. So because this is a web application, it's incredibly common in web application space to have these outside calls. In this case, it includes jQuery, Google Fonts, and some IPFS resources, potentially, not necessarily in this case. But the reason that I want to highlight that is because there is those IPFS resources need to be treated a little bit differently than, say, the jQuery or the Google font, because the underlying network in IPFS is a little bit more complicated than just loading a file. And of course, there's also the actual ownership associated with a particular Ethereum token. The viewer part is a little bit simpler, but we need to consider all of the pieces here if we're saying that we're going to try to reconstruct this in some distant unknown future. So we need to not just have the Ethereum token itself and a way to store it in a wallet, but we need the viewing software, which in this case is a web browser right now. We potentially need an underlying operating system or to run all of this so that you don't have an outdated version of Firefox that no longer runs. These are the typical problems that you would see anyways in preservation of a web-based artwork. So this isn't necessarily different, but there are additional concerns to keep in mind. Now, if you break all those individual pieces apart, some of them are more important to contain and to retain on your own. Some of them you can kind of depend upon the web in order to go re-access them in the future. But I'm just going here from what is most central to the artwork, so the purchase token and the unique assets, what is a little bit less common or it's critical to the artwork, but it's not necessarily embedded in it, the network dependencies, and then you can go as far down the rabbit hole as you really want. What I will call out here, though, is that you can make Docker instances that reconstruct all of the cloud portions of the system that I was talking about earlier. So if you put all of this together, then you can run your own virtual machine with a number of those Docker instances to reconstruct both the blockchain and IPFS storage if you want to. You can have another virtual machine that has the artwork on it and include all of those dependencies that you capture early on in the life of the work. And you can have multiple client machines potentially connecting to them so long as you have the actual copies of the artwork itself. This does leave a few open questions, though. One of them is just whether transactions are actually emulatable in a meaningful way. If the point of the artwork is to be out on a public chain, then making that chain private, does that compromise the work? There might be technical problems bringing that public blockchain into the private space. When exactly do you do this? This gets into the different strategies that John mentioned before around trying to either recreate or continue a blockchain that may be dying in some way. Can you just take the data out of the tokens and move it over? This is similar to that paper wallet concept that John mentioned. And what exactly are you going to do with it? Just because you have a copy or a snapshot of a blockchain at any given time, most of these works are intended to be time or duration based in some way. The ones that we're talking about in a sense, they bring the concept of the transaction into the work. How are you going to emulate that? When are you going to take it from the beginning of the chain or the end? So this isn't really providing a set solution. This is not a template, but it is a way to create the underlying infrastructure that allows you to then ask those more conceptual questions and pull a piece of the chain in to keep going in perpetuity. So with that, I believe we're at the end of our presentation. So if there are any questions, I believe we're ready for them.
Yeah, first rousing applause for this ideas of preservation. Thank you very much. I remember oh, yeah. Can you hear me now? Yeah, okay. Okay, yeah, so thank you. That was a rousing applause, and we thank you, of course, for this brilliant conceptual ideas of preservation. And John, I remember visiting you by the end of the 90s. I think it was the Guggenheim, where you were doing already pioneering work. And same today with Regina and John. And and I like how you draw the line from the variable media questionnaire to the blockchain storage strategies, all of you mentioning migration, emulation, reinterpretation. And yeah, so my question is, well, I have one question to John and one to Regina, and also for the others, of course. Do you see, if we consider that traditional digital art, at this point still, in most of the cases, is lost, would your strategy be applicable for an individual institution like one museum, or do we need a kind of a network for that? And to Regina, since you seem to have a good overview on the developments in this field, are there also, so what are for you in your mind, can you yeah, give us an idea, are there also content-wise interesting tendencies, like where artists deal with climate or surveillance, or like with other topics of our time, or is it mostly really only with the code?
Sorry, was that John, me, or John Napolito?
I'd like to hear John's answer. John Belkin.
Okay. I mean, yeah, I think it is within the scope of an individual institution to do that. I think it will be more robust and a better simulation of what was trying to exist in the past with the actual blockchain to distribute across multiple institutions. But yeah, that is all technically within the purview of one institution if you wanted to commit the resources to it. It's not inconsiderable amount of resources, but it's also not a truly massive number of resources. The other thing that I would add there is that I think the question of having an individual institution take ownership of all of this, once they have the blockchain emulated, so let's say that you have 3 emulated Ethereum nodes, you're not just backing a single artwork with that infrastructure. If you're collecting a number of different Ethereum-based artworks, and once you have those 3 nodes running, then you're covered for the Ethereum component of all of that. So it's not like you have to do this for every individual work that you're collecting.
That's right. That's right. And I agree completely. It could be 3 nodes across multiple institutions that are willing to dedicate the hardware, or it could be 1,000. I mean, ideally, to just continue upholding this ledger. And I think John was alluding to this a little. You're upholding, if you go that route, this like live, just like full node hosting, you're hosting the entire history of that ledger period from the beginning of time. That's what the consensus is. But to the point, if I understand your question correctly about content that could be collected, or works that are interesting outside of just like code-based works on chain, there absolutely are institutions right now considering not just works that have behavioral performative elements involved with the blockchain, but also conceptual and social and historical commentaries around this technology. A good example is a show that is in San Francisco right now at Minnesota Projects with Bitforms Gallery. Claudia Hart, an artist, curated it, and the show is about digital combines. It's this concept of how do you take, one of the works, for example, is on wood, right? And it's just about like writing into the metadata that the NFT points to that, you know, to sell this NFT conceptually, you need to include this tangible, more traditional object with the NFT. So those works are also, you know, I think a museum in Russia showed this work as well. So like there are institutions that are considering those kind of conceptual ideas around the topic of blockchain outside of this more niche scope that we discussed today that has larger preservation implications.
Thank you. Are there any questions? I assume there are questions here in the audience on this hot issue. Okay.
I have one question. Since token money is not like a fiat money that it's based on economy, token money is a closed system. So you are talking about a closed system. Have you done the research that puts it into conjunction? Because if you look through the history, usually when issue of money comes into art, it's a time of crisis. You understand?
Sorry, yeah. So I think the mining aspect of it can be isolated to some degree, given the system that we're talking about here. Running a Ethereum node does not necessarily mean that it's a mining node. There can be different types of nodes that you want to run on your own internal system. I think actually mining introduces some potential opportunities to do interesting things, just in terms of how do you reconstruct things like gas taxes, which we didn't talk about, which are involved in supporting ongoing transactions on chains. Once you start to reconstruct those and make them more specific to particular artworks, then that not only helps bring you back closer to the original work, but it also provides new opportunities for people to interact with the piece in slightly different ways and to conceptualize their interaction with the piece in slightly different ways. So I think that it's hard to get away from the mining question with these particular works because it is on the public network right now, and that is intrinsically part of how it's being presented. But if you want to, for purely archival purposes, you can just eliminate that completely.
And I just quickly wanted to say that, like, if we look at the utility of any emerging technology throughout history, there were use cases outside of the arts. It's like artists are choosing to utilize these technologies, at least this subset we're speaking about, in these conceptual experimental ways that don't necessitate or even sometimes make commentaries on the financialization. That's just what's been the hot topic for everybody to talk about. So we should look back and go, what are the other technologies that artists have been experimenting with throughout history that had other financial use cases? You know, it's kind of, to me, like separate concepts.
I would also say that this is one of the things that I think is interesting about blockchain art, is that it does allow us to challenge or explore new models of ownership and collectorship, from enforcing royalties to, you know, one of the artists that we talked to has a piece where the work has to always have the same sale value. And that would be impossible to enforce in, you know, auction houses and normal gallery secondary sales. It was something that Saul LeWitt tried with his democratic drawings, which were supposed to sell for $100 a piece. But how do you enforce that? Well, if you're selling an NFT, there's code that enforces that. And, you know, Ria Myers literally created a piece like that. So I think there are huge problems with the motivation behind cryptocurrencies and the economic inequalities that result from them. But as an artistic medium, they do offer possibilities that are hard to achieve otherwise.
Unfortunately, we're running out of time already. So thank you again for your brilliant contribution. Another applause here from the See you soon, hopefully. Bye.
Thank you to all. Enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thanks, everybody.
And we meet again in about 10-12 minutes. Okay. Okay. We meet again in about 10-12 minutes for the next session. Is it on the system or presentations?
No, only make one last update, so after to get back to replace the one existing.
Okay, I see it's on.